Welcome to the Ohio Adult Allies Podcast, where we are developing, inspiring, and empowering youth leaders. For today's podcast, we're discussing adultism.
Thank you so much for joining us for a conversation today on a topic that is of much importance to the Ohio Adult Allies Network, which is adultism. My name is Jessica Kalura. I am a research associate at Ohio University's Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Service. I do not personally facilitate a youth-led group, but I have the honor of working with the Adult Allies throughout the state as we learn best practices together in order to facilitate youth-led programs. I'm happy today to have two guests with me. The first is Mr. Sean Jeffers. If you'd like to introduce yourself, Sean, you can just tell us your name and the youth-led group you facilitate and the number of years of experience you have.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Jessica. So my name is Sean Jeffers. I am Director of Leadership Development at Youth at the Center in Cincinnati, Ohio, and our youth-led group is called Young Not Silent. And I've been leading that group for the past 5 years now.
Thanks, Sean. And we also have Tina McGill with us today. Tina, can you please introduce yourself?
I am Christine McGill, but I go by Tina. I work in school-based prevention with student services in Belmont County, Ohio. I started my journey with youth-led prevention in 2018. And at that point, I'd never heard of it, but I went through the training program and I helped develop the Youth Empowering Peers, aka YEP group, which is a school-based youth-led program.
Thanks so much, Tina. So as I mentioned today, the topic is adultism, and that's a term that we may hear get thrown around, but may also have different meanings to different individuals. So I'm wondering, Tina, to start with, if you could explain what the term adultism means to you.
For me, just like many of the other prejudices that we hear about, the foundation of adultism is really rooted in the idea of superiority, specifically superior to a child or adolescents because of their age. And it's this belief that young people should be controlled, or maybe even not given power just because of their age, maybe because they're either too much or not enough, according to an adult.
Sean, how would you explain adultism?
Yeah, building off, I think Tina's hit a lot of the key points. I think anytime we hear that root word ism, we're talking about something that's systemic, that's structural. I think Tina really hit on that, right? There's a lot of ways that we systemically try to control young people. And there's this general idea that adults know better. And so I think when we're thinking about adultism, it's just assuming that because I am older, I know better. And not necessarily, and that's not always right, that's not always the truth. And so I think just being realistic about the fact that when we're doing youth-led programming, we really want young people to look at their communities, understand what's working, and lift the solutions up that they think are best able to address the things in their community. And so if we as adults assume we know better, we don't always take the time to hear young people, value their voices, and really let them lead. And so I think that's for us is, we often call ourselves adult allies that we are supporting, we are working with, helping opening up, barriers, that young people might be coming up against. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not assuming just because I am older or more experienced that I know better than what young people need to be able to positively impact their schools and communities.
Thank you both. So one of the things I'm hearing is that it's essentially a bias that can affect our ability or our interactions implicitly sometimes in the way that we're guiding our young people and working with our youth. So I wonder, as an adult ally, Sean, can you speak to what you personally do to identify adultism?
Sure. So I think a couple things come to mind as you say that, Jessica. One, I think there's a dynamic as adults, right? We, even a core part of our youth-led program is developing a strategic plan that has 5-year goals. And young people are in school for 4 years. So, so they're not going to be able to see the end of a 5-year goal that we have. And so just acknowledging, right, that young people have a finite amount of time. In high school, it's 4 years, or sometimes it's until they turn 18, depending on different programs, to make the difference they want to see in their community. And so I think as adults, sometimes we can be like, yeah, I hear you want to do that, but maybe next year, and so I think sometimes it's that aspect of, as a young, for young people, as an adult, I have to maybe put myself in their shoes sometimes and say, they don't have a next year if they're about to graduate. And so if this is something that they're passionate about, how can we help that happen? So I think that's the biggest thing, I think, is that perspective. I think the other piece is just, we always say the 3 most powerful words in the English language are tell me more. And so if a young person says they want to do something, says they have an idea about something, instead of just being the no, being like, I don't think the fill in the blank. I don't think, the CEO or the principal or the superintendent or the council or whoever's going to go for that idea. Sometimes we're so quick to be that no, just like, well, tell me more about why you think that's going to be a good idea. Like, tell me more about what that looks like. And I think the more we can engage young people, we equip them not only with a vision that they can really develop for their community, but also with those important critical thinking skills. They can really start to articulate and address what is it they're looking to change in their community. And so even if sometimes we can't get approval for their first idea, if we know their motivation, we can help, open up other doors for them. And so I think those are some of the things I think about as an adult, is just being aware of time and perspective.
We know that adultism is also pervasive, right? And that our young people are going to experience it. We want to be cognizant of it in our own interactions. And Sean, you gave some great insight into what we can be considering to kind of check ourselves for our own adultist behaviors. But knowing that adultism is also pervasive throughout society, you guys both acknowledged that when you were giving your definitions at the beginning. I'm wondering, Tina, if you can speak to an example or how young people in your program experienced adultism when they were engaging in their youth-led work.
So I've had young people come to me on different occasions about their experiences with adults, and it's not always been the most positive. I know for one group, they were attempting to post some material around their school that they had created, and there were some staff members who actually took the materials down, and they were laughing about the whole project. In another situation, actually several instances, I've had other young people come to me and they've told me that they've worked with adults who just wouldn't listen to them about their ideas, and those adults were pushing their own agenda. So the common thread for me really was hearing that in all of these instances, the adults were just overall dismissive. And they would talk about how the adult would say, well, this is what I want you to do. I'm the adult and this is how it's going to go. So the adult, while maybe they think, okay, this way I know it's going to work, and they may have good intentions, they're actually putting these kids down, these young people down, and saying, what you say, what you think doesn't matter.
So I'll say an example, I think, for us is actually how our youth-led group even got started. So a few years ago in Cincinnati, there was a Youth Commission of Cincinnati, was something that was started at our local city hall. And they organized a youth summit. And the first year on the flyer, it said the City of Cincinnati's Youth Commission of Cincinnati's Citywide Youth Summit. So it was a lot of words. And when we took that event over in year 3, and we were still, because it was a city entity and they like to have all the different names and things highlighted for the city purposes. When we took that event over, we started asking young people about, what is that name? Like, when you see this name, kind of what comes to mind? And the young people we were working with said, sounds like a name an adult came up with, which they weren't wrong, right? And so when we started asking young people, then what name would you like to have? Young Not Silent was the name that two of our students, CJ and Bruce, suggested. And so that was the theme for the event that year. And then the next year we adopted it as the name for both the summit and also our youth-led program, to really be able to hit on that idea of, right, like young people, we've all heard that old saying of young people should be seen and not heard. And we really wanted to flip that script to say, young people need to be seen, heard, and valued. And how can we have an event and a group that really lifts that up? So I think in a way, that's a piece where I think for young people that happened. And it wasn't just the name. I would say the other thing that came up from our group is that the first time we had a planning meeting, the person from the city who had been part of the first 2 years was there. And she said, like, you guys are doing things differently than we did. And I was like, well, how did you do things? She's like, well, we had 2 rooms. The adults would go in one room and they'd make the big decisions, and the youth would go in the other room and they would get to brainstorm and maybe give us some ideas. And I was like, yes, you are correct. We are doing things very differently than what you did, because we are letting young people brainstorm, come up with ideas, and then make the decisions. So yes, we are doing things differently because we're actually letting it be a youth-led program. So I think that's a way that adults were just like, they were saying like, we want youth voice or youth participation, but not really youth autonomy or youth decision-making. And I think that's another way adultism plays out, is we sometimes condescendingly give young people like crumbs and assume that you've had a chance to be part of it, so you should be happy. And it was like, it's ultimately their event. They're deciding what they want to do. So allowing that space to play out.
Yeah, that's a great example of tokenism, right? Where a lot of adult groups will advocate for youth voice or youth engagement or youth inclusion, whatever term they want to use. But ultimately what they're looking for is the tokenism to say like, well, we had some input from young people, but not really allowing young people an authentic opportunity to participate. So knowing that young people encounter these types of experiences on a regular basis, we heard from Tina that sometimes it's even with the strategies that they're trying to implement, that their strategies end up being belittled. We hear other ways in which they're just excluded from the start or invited as tokens to participate in something. I'm wondering what you do as an adult ally to prepare your young people for these potential encounters with adultism. And Tina, maybe we can hear from you and your thoughts on this first.
I like to ask my young people questions prior to them approaching other adults about projects or ideas. I'll ask them things like, well, how do you think your teachers or other adults in your community are going to respond to this? And what do you think pushback will look like from them, if at all? And at that point, we might discuss things like the value or the lack thereof behind someone else's negativity, because just like in that other situation where they had adults putting their project down, we want to assess, what does that matter, right? To a certain extent, and ask them, if someone does push back, if they are challenging what you're thinking of doing, how does that change your passion towards the subject, what you're looking to change? And remind them that we need to still push forward so that we can have a better community.
Sean, what would you add to that?
Yeah, I think one of the things we try to start off is with our young people, instead of starting the conversation with what is it you want to see changed, I think more so working with young people on being able to identify their own strengths and leadership styles. And so anytime we're having a youth-led group, starting there, because our experience has basically been, if we tell schools or community organizations that we're doing a leadership development program, they tend to send us students who are comfortable being in front, who are already presidents or leaders of different groups, and not really having a lot of room to grow and develop. And so when we really talk about leadership development, what we really want to highlight for our young people is, and for the adults, first off, is saying, who are those young people on the cusp of their leadership potential? Because schools so often send us a student who there is going to be least likely to embarrass the school in some way. That is their like overarching goal, versus really thinking more about that part. And so I think when we get young people in, since we are not a school-based, we're a community-based, and we're pulling from a number of different sources, we really want to help young people do like a strengths finder, or a via character strengths, or a leadership compass, or some activity where they're really able to understand how do they lead, and how do they lead in relation to others, and just highlighting for them that introverts are leaders too. You don't have to be an extrovert to be a leader, or somebody who's really comfortable being in front of groups. If we give introverts space to talk, they're oftentimes paying attention and observing a lot of things in the room. Just sometimes they don't have a space to really say what is going on. So I think lifting up those, how do we lift up those introverts? How do we lift up different folks? And so I think at the beginning of a process, if we help young people identify their strengths, their leadership styles, then as they go through the process, they can rely on those. It helps them build confidence. It helps them then being able to, when they're having conversation, with peers or with adults, bring those pieces out. And so it's like an added, I would say just an added confidence boost, I think, at the beginning, that then helps the process. So I think that's something we really try to ground our young people in, and then as they go through. And then I think the other piece too, as we go through, is that, by having it be data driven, in developing a strategic plan, that your young people, by having data about their community, this isn't just they woke up one day and had an idea. They did surveys, or they looked at regional data, or they did something around this. So I think a lot of times they run up against adults who have a notion or a general feeling about something. They're like, you guys are doing that? That's not really that big a deal. And it's like, what are you basing that on? Whereas our young people can say, well, do you know these things? And so if they have both the confidence and then 2 or 3 talking points that they've developed to kind of get that on people's radars, I think that changes the nature of the conversation. And if they don't have those, I think that's sometimes where young people can easily feel they get shot down, or just, disregarded in ways.
Thanks. So I hear a lot about kind of equipping them with the skills and making sure that they're confident and know their own leadership style, so that when they do encounter moments of adultism, they still feel somewhat prepared for it. I'm wondering if you've had to ever like debrief encounters, or kind of regroup after a setback that young people have had, if they felt like demoralized by, Tina, your example of posters being laughed at by adults. Like if they saw that, what do you then do in those situations to address it, or at least discuss it with your young people?
For me, I have different roles within my job. It's not just with youth led, it's also as a prevention specialist working in the classrooms. So I talk to students about coping mechanisms, but I also am one that I like to be as transparent and relatable as possible for anybody that I talk to. And one of those things that I feel, at least personally, is when we meet people who are putting us down, oftentimes it's a reflection of the hurt that they're having within themselves. So I talk to my young people about, well, what is it that you think they were thinking or feeling in that moment? Is it that they really thought that your project was stupid or worthless? Or is it that maybe your project is kind of triggering something within themselves that they're thinking, oh, wait, I don't know if I want to face that yet? Because facing things like youth depression or youth anxiety or substance use among youth is not really something that we often talk about in normal settings. It's swept under the rug. So for someone to bring that out and say, hey, we want to change this, you're having to admit that there's first a problem. So bringing them back to that idea of, okay, it's not that it's me, it's that they're not maybe ready for this message. And that's okay to some extent, but we're still going to push forward maybe in a different way.
Yeah, I think that approach that Tina lays out is the right approach in a lot of ways. And so there's a dynamic, right, when working with young people that they can get sometimes easily discouraged if they get really excited about an idea. And there's other times where they can get frustrated and it doesn't bother them. So I think each group we have, when you bring together a group of students, sometimes they have a slightly different dynamic. But I think that conversation, at least, so what did you experience? Is there any truth to the feedback you heard? So there's always a chance, I think, to look at and just say, even if it's just 20%, can we just say, what about this? Is there 20% we can actually listen to and maybe adjust around? Is there 80% maybe we say that's probably people, just as Tina said, maybe working out some of their own insecurities or their own, internalized stigma that they're kind of maybe working through that is then being projected onto your project. But at least I think we tell young people like a 20%, I think, which is a small, but at least allows a slight amount of accountability, a slight amount of a willingness to engage around this. And then being able to say, okay, now that we've at least been able to think about this, what can we own, what can we dismiss? I think that gives them a beautiful, as well, framework for dealing with giving and receiving feedback. Is that there's a lot of times we're getting feedback, we don't have to take it all. What is the feedback you're giving that you want to act on? What's the feedback you're giving sometimes that you're like, I don't, that doesn't really resonate with me. And so I think the way we can set this up, and I think that's one of the things I think that I've found most valuable about youth-led programs, is yes, you're working in people through a process now, but you're also trying to ground them with a foundation that really they can use as they navigate adulthood.
Me how much throughout this conversation it's really about perspective taking, even when we're kind of checking ourselves for our own adultist like actions and making sure that you're kind of questioning, understanding someone else's lens, and then also intentionally teaching those skills when moments arise to have young people kind of reflect on, what's the perspective from there, where's the truth, or what do we have like to listen to, and what can we kind of acknowledge are, other things that we can move forward with. And it relates to the next question I was going to ask, and I think we've heard it throughout this conversation, but we're talking specifically about adultism. But I'm wondering how adultism intersects with other isms in our society, like racism or classism. And so what's that relationship or intersection that you see?
I'll jump in on this one, I think, because there's a couple things that come up for me. One, when we talked about the example a second ago about grounding our young people in strengths and leadership, one of the things we also ground them in is identity development. And there's a recognition, right, that like different leadership terms are used to affirm people's, sometimes based on their identities. So as a man, if I am loud or passionate in a meeting, that I am seen as like, being commanding or, really passionate about an issue. Whereas if a young person who's a woman does the same thing, or even an adult, sometimes then they're called bossy. And so there's this aspect around similar behaviors are playing out. And so I think we have to recognize that the strengths, the characteristics that we sometimes attribute to young people, that those can play out a lot of times around their identities. The other thing I would say is it's a lot of times young people, we're telling them they're not enough. And so there's examples, right, where like young people walk into a space, and if they happen to have their pants sagging a little bit, then adults instantly want to tell them to pull up their pants, or, or dress differently, or why do you have your hair like that? Why do you have piercings? Why do you have tattoos? Why do you, whatever the case may be, there's so many things that adults are putting onto young people. And I think those then become the ways, and oftentimes what the adults will say is, well, I'm really trying to help them like be professional. But it's professional according to who? And so a lot of young people are trying to navigate a world that was set up without them in mind. So a lot of our young people of color, a lot of women, a lot of LGBTQ folks, they weren't created with, the systems weren't created with them in mind. they were largely created for white, male, cisgender, heterosexual, Christian people in mind. So if you don't fit into that box, sometimes you feel like you're already, just showing up. Sometimes you're already having to prove yourself. You don't even get in the space. And so I think that's one of the things when we think about adultism. So often young people, when they show up to a space, regardless of how they identify, are already seen as, oh, you're a young person, so therefore and adults start going through the stereotypes or assumptions in their mind. You're lazy, you're entitled, you're ungrateful, you're, just apathetic about the world, and they start going through these things. And so I think one of the things we often say is go beyond just who somebody is, but really deeper understanding about what can people bring, what can people contribute, what are their passions. And then also as adults, what are our aspirations for young people? So what are our assumptions, but what are our aspirations for what we want young people to be, and then move in that direction. So I think once we do our own work around unpacking what identity-based stereotypes or assumptions I might play into for different young people, then if I start talking about aspirations, then I can actually move beyond that individual case, more saying, I want young people to be, really have the skills to navigate where they want to go. And so if that's my aspiration for young people, then what am I equipping them with as they're going through processes?
There are many theories within sociology that discuss how we create culture. And one of those is that everything is socially constructed. Like I mentioned earlier with the prejudice, isms like adultism, racism, etc., are based on that idea of superiority. And those beliefs, though, are not hard truths. These are beliefs that are the products of people who are actually constructing their own perceptions of others. They're attempting to put groups into a socially constructed box so that they can fit what they want, like Sean was talking about. If people create a culture that promotes these prejudices, they have the ability to influence other people around them. So then they can act on those prejudices in the forms of maybe discrimination and even oppression. Our view of young people can change. And as an adult ally, I think we need to be aware of our own beliefs, reflective of our thoughts or actions towards young people, being mindful of how the systems can help perpetuate these different prejudices. And we need to do what we can to educate ourselves to then create an inclusive environment so young people can really mobilize what they want.
Yeah, Tina, that what you were saying, I think that social construction, right, is like where I was hitting it a little bit around just people not fitting in. But the other thing that you bring up that I think is really important is, as adults, we often think about like, well, we've created a space where young people and adults are in the same room, so therefore we've succeeded. But we've really gone from just a segregation to an assimilation dynamic. We haven't actually created a space that is really maybe youth-led. And so I think as Tina talks about that, social construction idea, really thinking about, have we really reduced and eliminated barriers to young people's participation? Or have we just allowed them a seat at the table, but I think to use Jessica's word from earlier, tokenism. So a number of school boards, right? Like they say, we're gonna have a youth representative on the school board. And you take one youth representative, put them with 7 elected officials. These are people who had to run for office, had to like go out, raise money and get signatures and go to town halls. And so they are experienced in doing all this stuff. And now you're putting a 16 or 17-year-old and expecting them to hold their own against 7 adult politicians. Like, it's just not a fair dynamic. So we've really just taken a segregation where we say, well, there's no youth and now there's one. So that we've not actually done anything to actual level the playing field. And so I think that's where we really have to start thinking about is how do we create equitable solutions that really acknowledge and shift spaces to allow young people's voices to really come through.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Sean, because I think a lot of times I've had conversations with other adult allies about this when their young people are going to go serve on a board. And oftentimes we do focus so much on preparing the young people for what the experience is going to be. But if you really want it to be a positive, more equitable experience, you also need to prepare the adults. I think sometimes as adult allies, we forget that because we have the privilege of working with young people on a regular basis and ideally, hopefully reflecting on these tensions through our interactions. And we forget that most of the adults who are operating in solely adult spaces oftentimes aren't prepared for young people to be in that room and haven't stopped to critically reflect on what it means and what behaviors they can enact in order to create kind of a more welcoming space to begin with. And then what barriers you have to break down to ensure that their voices are authentically respected and heard, you know, as they have a right to be heard. I've learned a lot from this conversation, and I'm wondering if, in summary, if you could each give one piece of advice to adult allies about acknowledging and addressing adultism, what would it be? And maybe Tina, we can hear from you first here on your advice for adult allies.
I would say be mindful. Be mindful of how you interact with other people. Ask yourself, would I talk to my colleague in this manner? Or better yet, your friend, a loved one, because hopefully you're talking to them with empathy and respect, right? Show that same care to a young person. Remember that you're a team in these projects that you're dealing with. I think to myself, I may have experience in one area, but that doesn't mean that I always have the right answer to every single situation. And I heard a statement years ago, I actually hung it up on my desk. It says, seek first to understand, then to be understood. In addition to that, I always think back to my favorite professor in my undergraduate career. It was my final class of my senior year, and I remember him standing up in front of us saying, you guys are brilliant, just brilliant, but you're also infinitely ignorant. And that spoke to me because, yes, we can feel confident in many different ways and be able to identify our strengths. But at the same time, we have to understand that we are infinitely ignorant because there's always more to learn. Ignorance is the lack of knowledge, right? So if we think of ourselves as continuous lifelong learners, that's going to be helpful. If we approach people, no matter their age, their background, what have you, with that stuff in mind, we're going to be able to treat people in a way that they feel valued and empowered.
I'm reminded of a conversation I had recently with one of our other youth facilitators, and over the past year, right, we've been meeting virtually, and so sometimes it's tough to get young people to talk, and you're having a conversation, and you're just hopeful that somebody's going to say something, and as you know, and sometimes it can be like pulling teeth. But I think there's also a recognition, and this is what I shared with the co-facilitator when they were like, how do I get them to talk? And I was like, you have to realize that they go to schools and are basically experiences where they're not encouraged to always think or talk about what's going on. For so many young people, they have story after story about how in class, they'll maybe have asked why to the teacher because they're trying to make sense of what is this lesson we're doing, and I'm just trying to understand where should I categorize this? How does this connect to what else we've done? And the teacher assumes that they're being insubordinate in this moment. And so they're not encouraged to actually ask why or explore. And so much of our traditional education is really about get information, regurgitate it on the test, move on to the next topic. Taking away from this podcast, what I hope is, like, number one, is we really think intentionally about, you know, what does it look like for me as an adult ally to meet young people where they are, respect their autonomy, and really create spaces for them to use their voice. And then I think the other piece is, even if we do all of that, young people don't just magically always have the skills to fully participate. And so it's not just enough to say, well, I asked a question, nobody answered it, so I'm just going to do what I want to do. Maybe I asked a question in a way that wasn't making sense to the young people. Maybe I've asked the question in a different way. Maybe we have to create a different way. Maybe we say, take 5 minutes and do a free write and then talk, and whatever the case may be. But so often I think we create a space, young people don't immediately adapt to the space we've created, and then we revert back to all the old things we used to do and the bad habits. So I think that's really what I would say as we move forward, is meet young people where they're at, and then really think about how can we give them the space to grow into their leadership, because that's ultimately going to be a lifelong skill that they develop now and can be a foundation as they move towards adulthood.
Thank you both for sharing that wisdom and for engaging in today's conversation. I hope that it's the start of much broader conversations throughout our Ohio Adult Allies Network.
Thank you for joining the Ohio Adult Allies podcast. You can stream us on all of your devices on Spotify, iTunes, and Google Play. Visit us at www.ohioadultallies.com.